The first light of dawn in Red Rock Pass did not arrive gently. It was a sharp, clean thing, slicing over the jagged peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains and spilling across the high desert floor like watered-down blood. The air, still cool from the night, carried the scent of dust, creosote, and the promise of heat. Inside a small, clapboard building fronting the town's main thoroughfare, Eliza McKenna was already moving. The sign above her door, painted in neat, steady letters, read E. McKenna, seamstress and photographic arts. She worked with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. First, she stoked the embers in her small cast-iron stove, adding just enough wood to bring a kettle to a low simmer. The smell of coffee grounds hitting hot water soon followed, a rich, dark aroma that was her personal flag of truce against the morning. While the coffee brewed, she organized her workspace. On one side of the room stood the tools of her primary trade bolts of sturdy denim and soft calico, spools of thread in a rainbow of practical colors, and the gleaming black and gold of her treadle sewing machine. On the other side, shrouded beneath a heavy black cloth, was her second passion, a large wooden box camera on a heavy tripod, its brass lens aimed at a painted backdrop of a serene mountain landscape that did not exist anywhere near Red Rock Pass. Beside it was a small, carefully arranged collection of glass plates, chemical bottles, and trays. A miner named Hank, his face a roadmap of dust and sun, was her first customer. He held out a canvas shirt with a tear clean through the shoulder. "Morning. Eliza. Had a bit of a disagreement with a rock slide yesterday." Eliza took the shirt, her fingers assessing the damage. "Looks like the rock slide won. Hank, coffee's on the stove. Help yourself while I see if this is a repair or a resurrection." Her voice was low and carried a dry humor that most men in town found either baffling or deeply charming. Hank grunted his thanks and poured a cup of the steaming black liquid. Eliza sat at her machine, her foot setting a steady rhythm on the treadle. The needle danced, stitching the torn fabric back into a semblance of wholeness. She worked not just with skill, but with a quiet pride. This small shop, the scent of coffee, the hum of the machine, it was all hers. Bought and paid for with the inheritance her late husband had left. A sum earned by disappearing into a silver mine one morning and never coming out. The town had expected her to pack up or marry again. She had done neither. She was just handing the mended shirt back to Hank when the sound began, a low rumble that grew into the rhythmic thunder of shod hooves on hard-packed earth. Eliza and Hank moved to the doorway. A thick plume of dust rolled down the street. At its head, a man whose authority was as plain as the star pinned to his vest. Marshal Jed Crow rode tall in the saddle, his face set in a permanent scowl, his eyes sweeping over the town as if looking for an insult. Behind him, his deputies herded a group of weary-looking men and a single supply wagon. Crow reined his horse to a halt in the center of town, a self-appointed stage. Shopkeepers and miners emerged from their doorways, drawn by the commotion. "Listen up." Crow's voice was a gravelly roar that cut through the morning quiet. "Found the Cates Brothers supply wagon 10 miles out. Busted up. The Cates boys are gone. It was an Apache raiding party. Took the guns, took the food, and left nothing but wreckage." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Fear, old and familiar, tightened faces. Anger followed close behind. It was always the Apache. Every misfortune, from a dry well to a spooked horse, was laid at their feet. Eliza felt a familiar knot of unease in her stomach. It was too neat, too simple. Her gaze drifted from Crow's righteous scowl to the wagon itself. It looked less like the victim of a raid and more like it had simply tipped over. One of the crates, its lid splintered, had slid partially off. From this angle, she could see something stenciled on its side, a symbol half obscured by dirt. An impulse, sharp and sudden, seized her. She moved back into her shop, her expression unhurried. "Hank, do me a favor. Stand right there in the doorway. Look interested." "What for?" "I need a subject to practice my lighting." she said, her voice smooth as butter. She was already behind the big wooden camera, pulling the dark cloth over her head. To anyone watching, she was just the town's eccentric photographer, fussing with her equipment. Under the cloth, in the upside-down world of the ground glass, she adjusted the focus. She bypassed Hank entirely. The brass lens moved, infinitesimally, until it found the wagon, the splintered crate, the stenciled mark. It was a circle with a diagonal line through it, the unmistakable brand of Silas Pike's railroad and lumber operation. Pike's company was buying up land all over the territory, and his methods weren't always gentle. She slid a prepared wet plate into the camera, uncapped the lens, and counted the seconds in her head. The world holding its breath with her, she capped it, removed the plate, and disappeared into the tiny dark room she had built in a back corner. The chemical smell, sharp and clean, filled her nostrils. As the image slowly materialized on the glass, a ghost in silver and black, she saw it clearly, the Pike emblem. It made no sense. Why would a railroad supply crate be on a prospector's wagon supposedly attacked by Apaches? The photograph was streaked, imperfect, the details slightly blurred at the edges. The truth, it seemed, was still out of focus. When she emerged, the crowd around Marshal Crowe had dispersed, leaving behind a residue of fear and suspicion. The rest of the morning passed in a tense quiet. Then, around midday, they arrived. There were 4 of them, a man, 2 elderly women, and a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They moved without a sound, their worn moccasins stirring no dust. The man walked in front, tall and lean, his face a study in composure. He carried no visible weapon, only a calm dignity that seemed to unnerve the townsfolk more than any rifle could. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. His eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. He led a single pony laden with carefully folded deer and rabbit hides. They stopped not in the center of town, but quietly, respectfully, outside the general store. The man, Nantan, spoke to the proprietor in polite, measured English, his voice low but clear. He had come to trade for salt, flour, and coffee. A lawful transaction, protected by treaty. It did not take long for Marshal Crowe to appear, his deputies flanking him like vultures. "What's this?" Crowe demanded, positioning himself to block the store's entrance. "You got a lot of nerve, showing your faces here today." Nantan's expression did not change. He simply inclined his head. "Marshal, we come to trade. These hides are good." "I'll be the judge of that," Crowe sneered. He hooked a thumb toward the 2 old women, who stood with unshakable poise, their face in networks of fine lines that spoke of seasons and sorrows. "What are they carrying in those bundles?" "Herbs," Nantan said, "for medicine, and woven baskets to trade." "Let me see." Nantan remained still. "That is not necessary. We are not accused of any crime." From her doorway, Eliza watched the scene unfold. She saw the flickers of fear in the eyes of the other merchants, the aggressive posture of Crowe's men. She saw the little boy press himself against one of the women's legs, his wide eyes fixed on the marshal's shiny star, and she saw the quiet, unbreakable strength in Nantan. He was not looking for a fight. He was simply refusing to be bowed. Crowe took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "In case you haven't heard, your people are on a rampage. I could lock you all up right now, just on suspicion." That was enough. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out into the sunlight, her shadow falling between the Marshal and the Apache family. "Marshal Crowe," she said, her tone as pleasant as a Sunday social. "I do believe the territorial treaty allows for open trade at designated townships, and as I recall, Red Rock Pass is one of them." Crowe turned, his eyes narrowing. "This is official business. Eliza, stay out of it." "It's my business when a man is trying to stop commerce on my street," she replied, giving him a small, polite smile. Mr. Herbert over there looks to be losing a perfectly good transaction. Bad for the town's economy. She gestured with her head toward the store owner, who was trying to look invisible. Besides, I was hoping to trade for one of those baskets myself. They're much better made than the ones you can order from back east. Her intervention shifted the dynamic. It was no longer a lawman confronting a savage. It was a woman talking business. The tension did not disappear, but it changed its shape. Crow was a bully, and bullies were often flummoxed by a lack of outright fear. "These people are suspects," he blustered. "Suspects in what exactly?" Eliza asked, her voice still light. "Being thirsty. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime, even for an Apache. Let them get their supplies. Marshal, it's too hot a day for a scene." Crow glared at her, then at Nantan, who had not moved a muscle. He was being watched. The whole town was watching. To press the issue would make him look weak, baited by a seamstress, with a curse under his breath. He finally stepped aside. "Make it quick, and then get out of my town." Nantan gave Eliza a look. It was not a smile, not quite a nod. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement, a flicker of recognition that passed between two people who understood the currency of courage. He then completed his trade, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As they prepared to leave, one of the old women approached Eliza and held out a small, tightly woven basket, its design a series of interlocking steps. Eliza reached for her coin purse, but the woman simply pressed the basket into her hands and walked away. That night, a wind kicked up, howling down from the mountains and rattling the windows of Eliza's small shop. She sat at her table, cleaning the glass plate from the morning, the image of the pike crate now just a memory. The encounter in the street played over in her mind Crow's blustering rage, the quiet fortitude of Nantan, the weight of the small basket in her hands. She was about to bank the fire for the night when a flicker of orange light caught her eye. It was not the gentle glow of a lantern. This light danced and leaped, growing brighter with every second. Then came the shouts. "Fire, fire at the warehouse." Eliza ran to the window. The town's main supply warehouse, a massive wooden structure near the edge of town, was engulfed in flames. The fire climbed the walls, roaring into the night sky, painting the underside of the wind-whipped clouds a terrifying, furious red. The whole town was running toward the blaze, a disorganized bucket brigade already forming. But Eliza's gaze was drawn away from the fire, toward the dark alley that ran behind her shop. A figure burst from the shadows, running hard, not toward the fire, but away from it. It was a silhouette, a man, his movements frantic. He was lean and wore a slouch hat, and in the fleeting, hellish light of the fire, one thing was perfectly clear. He was a white man. She watched until he disappeared into the darkness. The town's alarm bell began to peal, a frantic, desperate clang, and above it all, she could already hear Marshal Crow's voice, bellowing for all to hear. "It's the Apache. They've come back to burn us out. It's the Apache." Eliza stood frozen at the window, the heat of the distant fire on her face, the cold certainty of a lie settling deep in her bones. The truth was not just blurred anymore. Someone was actively trying to set it on fire. The morning air was thick with the ghost of the fire. A haze of smoke hung over Red Rock Pass, acrid and gray, a bitter shroud for the bright desert sun. The town was a hive of angry, fearful murmuring. Men gathered in small knots, their faces grim, their voices low and hard. The word Apache was on everyone's lips, a curse and a conviction. Eliza McKenna swept the dust from her shop's threshold, but the scent of ash clung to everything, a constant reminder of the night's violence. She had just finished brewing her morning coffee when the heavy tramp of boots on her boardwalk announced him. The door swung open without a knock. Marshal Jed Crow filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. Two of his deputies hovered behind him, their expressions a mixture of apology and intimidation. Crow's eyes scanned the small shop. dismissing the bolts of fabric and settling on the hulking shape of the camera. He stepped inside, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. He told her he heard she was taking pictures yesterday. Eliza did not stop polishing a glass tumbler. She answered that she took pictures most days. It was, she reminded him, part of her business. The marshal leaned a hand against her work table, his proximity a calculated threat. He said this was not about business. He had a witness who saw her pointing that contraption of hers at his wagon. He wanted the plate. A cold knot tightened in Eliza's stomach, but her hands remained steady. She set the tumbler down and met his gaze. She replied that there was not much to see. The plate was ruined, the light was poor, and all the commotion had shaken the tripod. It was a blurry mess. She had already wiped it clean to reuse the glass. It was expensive. After all, Crow's eyes narrowed. He did not believe her. He said he would be the judge of that. He demanded she show it to him. Eliza feigned a sigh of exasperation, the weary shopkeeper dealing with a difficult customer. She walked to a small wooden crate where she kept her spoiled plates and materials for recycling. She shuffled through a few pieces of glass before pulling one out. It was streaked with the ghostly, distorted shapes of a failed landscape portrait she had attempted weeks ago. You could just make out the shape of a wagon wheel. A happy accident. She held it up to the light. She told him there it was. As she said, a blurry mess. Not good for anything. The marshal snatched the plate from her hand. Holding it close to his face, he grunted in frustration. The image was useless. He had no eye for the photographic arts. All he saw was a smear. He shoved the plate back at her, nearly making her drop it. He warned her that if he found out she was holding back, it would go badly for her. He was building a case, and he would not have some woman with a toy camera getting in his way. He turned and stormed out, his deputies trailing in his wake. Eliza waited until their footsteps had faded completely. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. Then she walked to the other side of the room, to a large bolt of dark blue denim. She reached deep into the roll, her fingers finding the small, oilcloth packet she had hidden there. Inside was the real plate, the one with the blurry, but still identifiable, emblem of Silas Pike's company. The truth was safe, for now. But for the first time since her husband's death, Eliza felt a profound and chilling fear. She was alone, and she had made a powerful enemy. The day bled into a long, tense afternoon. Business was non-existent. The townsfolk were too consumed by the fire and the fear to think about mending shirts. As twilight began to paint the mountains in shades of purple and orange, Eliza decided to close her shop early. She bolted the front door and was tidying her counter when she heard a noise from the alley that ran along the side of her building. It was the sound of a crate being kicked over, followed by a low chuckle. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the stove. Holding it tight, she moved to the back door and peered through its small window. 2 men were waiting in the shadows. They were rough-looking, men she recognized as part of the crew Silas Pike had brought in for the railroad. They were not lawmen. They were something else. One of them called out to her. He said they knew she was in there. Pike wanted to talk to her. He thought she might have something that belonged to him. Eliza's blood ran cold. She told them to go away. She had nothing for them. The other man laughed. He said they could do this the easy way or the hard way. He suggested she open the door. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. The front was bolted. The back was blocked. There were no other exits. The poker suddenly felt flimsy and useless in her hands. She was trapped. A heavy shoulder slammed against the back door. The wood groaned in protest. Another slam, and the frame splintered. They were coming in. Then, from the deeper shadows at the far end of the alley, a third figure emerged. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly silent. It was Nantan. He did not shout or make a grand entrance. One moment the alley was empty of hope. The next, he was simply there. Pike's men turned, surprised. One of them demanded to know who he was. Nantan did not answer with words. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. The first man swung a clumsy fist. Nantan swayed under it, his own hand a blur of motion as he struck the man hard in the stomach. The man folded with a wheezing gasp. The second thug was more cautious. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife. The blade glinted in the fading light. He lunged, stabbing at Nantan's chest. Nantan moved like a cat, turning his body so the blade only sliced through the fabric of his cotton shirt, grazing the skin of his side. The man's momentum carried him forward, off balance. Nantan used the man's own weight against him, seizing his wrist and twisting. There was a sharp crack of bone and a scream of pain. The knife clattered to the ground. The man stumbled back, clutching his broken arm. His companion, having gotten his wind back, took one look at Nantan's cold, focused eyes and the ruin of his friend's arm, and decided he had urgent business elsewhere. He scrambled to his feet and fled down the alley, his friend crying out in pain as he followed. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of Eliza's breathing. She lowered the poker, her knuckles white. Nantan stood over the dropped knife for a moment before kicking it into the darkness. He turned to look at her through the splintered doorway. His face was impassive, but his eyes were asking a question. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak. She noticed then the long, clean tear in his shirt and the thin line of red welling up on the skin beneath. She stepped outside, her fear replaced by a sudden, overwhelming sense of purpose. She told him he was hurt. She pointed to his side. She said to come inside. She would fix it, both the cut and the shirt. He hesitated for only a second, his gaze sweeping the rooftops, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then he gave a slight nod and followed her into the shop. She lit a lantern, the warm yellow light pushing back the encroaching darkness. She motioned for him to sit while she fetched her medical supplies, a small bottle of carbolic acid and clean bandages. The cut was shallow, a long scratch more than a wound. She cleaned it gently, her touch surprisingly steady. He sat perfectly still, not flinching. When she was done, she looked at the torn shirt. It was a simple garment, but well made. She went to her sewing table and returned with a needle and a spool of dark thread. She told him to hold still. This would only take a moment. She stood close to him, the lantern light casting their mingled shadows long against the wall. She began to sew. Her stitches were small, neat, and efficient. The needle moved back and forth, pulling the separated edges of the fabric together. It was a simple, domestic act, an act she performed a dozen times a day, but in the quiet of the shop, with the scent of smoke and fear still in the air, it became something more. It was a thread of trust being woven in the silence. It was a bond being mended. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. He said they were Pike's men. Eliza did not look up from her work. She asked him how he knew. He explained that Pike had been moving cattle, a large herd, but he did not drive them along the main trails. He drove them west, across the rocky land that bordered the Apache territory. The cattle were stolen from small homesteads, their brands altered. Pike's men left a wide, messy trail that led directly toward the mountains where his people were camped. The needle paused in her hand. Eliza looked up at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. The raid on the Cates brothers' wagon, the fire at the warehouse, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed story to turn the town against his people. She said they were being framed. He confirmed it. He said Crow was either part of it or a fool who was being used. The trail of the cattle was the proof. The tracks were deep, cut by hundreds of hooves, and among them, there would be the tracks of the wagons that supplied Pike's men, wagons that would bear his mark. They led to a place his people called the Stone Jaw Canyon. He had seen the tracks himself. He needed to get a better look, to find something that would prove the trail began on land Pike controlled, not on theirs. She finished her last stitch and bit the thread. The tear was gone, replaced by a neat, strong seam. She looked from the mended shirt to Nantan's serious face. The choice was laid bare before her. She could stay here, in her shop, and pretend she had seen nothing, heard nothing. She could bolt her doors and hope Pike's men left her alone. That was the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. Or she could follow the thread of truth, no matter how dangerous the path. She thought of the little boy hiding behind his grandmother's skirts. She thought of Nantan standing calm and defiant against the marshal's hate. She thought of the glass plate hidden in the bolt of cloth. Fear was a cold, heavy thing, but her conscience was heavier. She met Nantan's gaze. She told him that a photograph of those tracks would be better proof than his word alone. Her voice was steady, much steadier than she felt. A flicker of surprise showed in his eyes. He asked if she was offering to come with him. She gave a small, wry smile. She said it seemed her particular skills were suddenly in high demand in the wilderness. She would need to pack her camera and some coffee. She would not face a conspiracy without coffee. The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. He stood up, testing the mended seam with his fingers. It was strong. He said they would leave before sunrise. They would travel fast. Eliza nodded. Her world, once as contained and orderly as her sewing box, had just been ripped wide open, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she was the only one who could stitch it back together. They left Red Rock Pass under the cover of a moonless sky, two shadows moving against the deeper shadows of the landscape. Eliza had packed her photographic equipment with painstaking care, wrapping each glass plate and bottle of chemicals in thick cloth. The entire kit was heavy and awkward, loaded onto a pack mule that seemed to resent the task. She rode a sturdy mare, feeling the unfamiliar rhythm of the horse beneath her. Nantan led the way on foot, his stride long and effortless, a stark contrast to the mule's grudging plod. The town, with its simmering anger and false accusations, fell away behind them. The world opened up into a vast, silent expanse of rock and sand. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the desert revealed its true character. It was not empty, as she had always imagined, but full of a fierce, tenacious life. Tall, spiky yucca plants stood like sentinels, their pale flowers ghostly in the pre-dawn light. Gnarled mesquite trees clung to the dry earth. Eliza, a woman who measured her world in inches of fabric and ounces of chemicals, found herself humbled by the sheer scale of it all. Nantan was as much a part of this landscape as the rocks themselves. He navigated through a maze of dry washes, or arroyos, with an instinct that felt like magic. He pointed out the tracks of a coyote, the distant silhouette of a hawk circling on a thermal. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to share a piece of essential knowledge. He showed her how to find water, not in a flowing stream, but by digging at the base of a certain type of willow in a sandy wash until the ground grew dark and damp, yielding a few precious, cool mouthfuls. Later that day, as the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, he stopped beside a cluster of large rocks. He taught her how to build a fire with no smoke, using dry, dead wood from the heart of a fallen cactus, and arranging it in a small pit so the heat was focused and the flame was nearly invisible. They boiled water for coffee in her small tin pot, and the familiar, bitter aroma in that wild, alien place was a comfort so profound it almost brought tears to her eyes. She watched him, her artist's eye taking in the details, the way he moved without wasted motion, the deep focus in his dark eyes as he worked, the quiet respect he showed for the land that sustained him. He was not fighting the desert. He was in conversation with it. He was a man who knew his place in the world, a certainty Eliza found she envied. In the late afternoon, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The wind picked up, carrying a fine grit that stung their eyes and coated their tongues. Nantan pointed to a low ridge of rock. He told her a sandstorm was coming, a small one, but they needed shelter. They reached the rock face just as the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound. The air grew thick with sand, obscuring the sun and reducing visibility to a few feet. They huddled in the lee of the rock, the horses and mules standing with their tails to the wind, their heads low. Eliza pulled her kerchief up over her nose and mouth, the fine dust still managing to find its way in. It was a moment of absolute helplessness, a reminder of how small and fragile they were. She looked at Nantan. He was perfectly calm, his eyes closed as if he were simply resting. She asked him if he was not afraid. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He said the wind was not an enemy. It was just the land breathing. To fight it was to waste strength. To respect it was to endure. When the storm passed, as quickly as it had arrived, the world was remade. The light was soft, the air was clean, and every surface was coated in a fresh layer of fine, red dust. They moved on, and just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Nantan stopped. He pointed toward a small cluster of wickiups, domed shelters made of brush and hide, nestled in a box canyon, a thin tendril of smoke, smelling of roasting meat, rose into the still evening air. As they approached, people emerged from the shelters. They were Nantan's relatives, his chosen family. An elderly woman with a face as beautifully lined as a riverbed came forward. Her name was Nahila. She was the one who had given Eliza the basket in town. Her dark, intelligent eyes assessed Eliza with a gravity that was neither friendly nor hostile, merely watchful. The small boy from town, whose name Eliza learned was Doste, ran to Nantan and hugged his leg, chattering in a language she did not understand. Nantan rested a hand on the boy's head, and a warmth entered his expression that Eliza had not seen before. There was no grand ceremony, no romanticized welcome. It was simple and practical. They were offered water and a piece of roasted rabbit. Eliza, exhausted and covered in dust, accepted gratefully. She watched as Nahila directed the unpacking of the supplies Nantan had brought, her authority unquestioned. Eliza saw a community bound by necessity and a deep, unspoken affection. These were not the fearsome savages of Marshal Crow's rhetoric. They were families, trying to survive in a world that was closing in on them. Later, as they sat around a small, crackling fire, a rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. He was a young Apache man, his horse lathered in sweat. He spoke to Nantan in their own language, his voice urgent and low. Eliza could not understand the words, but she could read the impact they had. The warmth drained from Nantan's face, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Nahila looked at Eliza, and her gaze was direct. She spoke in English, her voice heavy. She explained that a hunting party, 2 men from their group, had been taken. Marshal Crow had found them on their way back to the camp. He had arrested them for leaving the designated territory. He was holding them in the Red Rock Pass jail. The charge was a pretense. They were hostages. The stakes had just been raised from a matter of justice to a matter of life and death. The fire no longer seemed warm, and the desert night felt suddenly cold and full of menace. Before the sun was fully up the next morning, Nantan led Eliza away from the camp. They rode toward the place he called Stone Jaw Canyon. As they traveled, she saw him watching the horizon, his calm demeanor replaced by a taut vigilance. He was worried for his people. The canyon was a narrow gash in the earth, its rock walls scarred and ancient. And there, baked into the hard, dry ground, was the proof they sought. The trail was wide and churned up, the tracks of hundreds of cattle mixed with the deep, unmistakable ruts of heavy wagon wheels. It was just as Nantan had described. Eliza got to work. Setting up the heavy camera on the uneven ground was a challenge. The desert heat made the wet plate chemistry volatile and unpredictable. She had to work quickly, her head under the dark cloth. The world turned upside down and backward on the ground glass. The air was stifling and smelled of ether and collodion. Nantan stood guard, his gaze constantly scanning the canyon rims. She focused the lens, first on a wide view of the churned-up trail, then on a specific, clear set of tracks. A deep wagon rut ran alongside a nearly perfect impression of a horseshoe, and on the horseshoe, just as she had hoped, was a small, raised circle with a diagonal line through it. Silas Pike's mark. She prepared a plate, her hands moving with a focused intensity. This was her weapon. This was her testimony. She slid the plate into the camera, took a deep breath, and uncapped the lens. The light of the desert poured in, burning the truth onto the fragile glass. As she was packing the plate holder away, Nantan suddenly stiffened. He gave a low whistle and motioned for her to be still. Eliza froze, her heart leaping into her throat. On the ridge above them, a rider sat on his horse, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. He was watching them. Eliza's first thought was that it was one of Pike's thugs, come to finish the job from the alley. But this man just sat there. He was too far away to see his face clearly, but he was young. She could tell that much. He wore the gear of a hired gunman, but he did not draw his weapon. He simply watched them, a solitary, uncertain figure. She saw him look from her, a woman alone with a strange box, to the camp in the distance, from which a thin wisp of morning smoke was now visible. She could almost feel his hesitation, a wavering in the air itself. This was not the simple job he had signed up for. He had been hired to push around some savages, not to be part of a war against women and children. The young man, Luke Mercer, lingered for a moment longer, a seed of doubt planted in the hard soil of his conscience. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he turned his horse and rode away. Nantan relaxed, but his eyes were grim. He said they were not safe here. They needed to go. Eliza carefully packed the exposed plate, her most precious possession. It was their only hope. She looked at the small, clear pool of water they had found earlier that morning, collected in a hollow in a rock, a rare and beautiful gift from the desert. Hope, she thought, was just like that water, precious, rare, and easily lost, and they would have to guard it with their lives. The photograph was a fragile, heavy promise in Eliza's hands, but Nantan knew it was not enough. A picture of a track in the dirt could be argued away, dismissed as a coincidence or a fabrication by a town that wanted to believe in a simpler, more convenient enemy. They had proof of the method, but not the motive. To expose the whole lie, they needed to show the people of Red Rock Pass why Silas Pike would go to such lengths. Nantan explained this as they rested the horses in the shade of a tall rock formation. He said Pike's ambition was like a railroad itself, a straight, unbending line that would cut through anything in its path, be it a mountain or a people. The railroad was the motive. His true destination was not some distant city, but the vast timber and rich minerals on the land his people had called home for generations. They needed proof of that destination. Their new target was a temporary supply depot Pike had built alongside the advancing line of track. A few miles from the canyon, it was a raw, ugly scar on the landscape, a collection of canvas tents in a single large, windowless wooden warehouse. It was where Pike's men were based, a hornet's nest of hired guns and rough laborers. Going there was a risk so profound it made Eliza's stomach clench. But looking at the grim resolve in Nantan's eyes, she knew he was right. They had to follow the tracks. They waited for nightfall, the sky turning from a brilliant, painted sunset to a deep, star-littered indigo. A line of dark clouds was building in the west, and the air grew heavy and still, pregnant with the possibility of a storm. It was the cover they needed. They left the horses and the mule tethered in a hidden ravine and approached the depot on foot, moving through the chaparral like ghosts. The camp was a small island of greasy yellow light and noise in the vast, silent dark. The sounds of rough laughter, a badly played harmonica, and drunken arguments drifted from the largest tent. A single guard walked a lazy patrol around the perimeter of the warehouse, his shadow long and distorted in the lantern light. They watched him, learning the rhythm of his patrol. He was bored and inattentive. When his route took him to the far side of the building, Nantan moved. He was a shadow detaching from other shadows. Eliza followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt clumsy and loud, certain that every scuff of her boot was a cannon shot in the stillness. Nantan led her to the back of the warehouse, where the wall was nothing but rough-hewn planks. He found a place where a warped board had pulled away from its frame, creating a narrow gap. It was just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of sawdust, creosote, and canvas. Crates were stacked high, filled with tools, railroad spikes, and tins of food. In the center of the large, open space, a long trestle table stood under a single hanging lantern, and spread across it, held down at the corners by rocks, was a map. They moved toward it, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was a survey map of the entire region. The existing railroad line was marked in black ink, but from the end of that line, another was drawn in a stark, brutal red. It did not follow the gentle contours of the land. It cut a perfectly straight path directly west, through the foothills and into the heart of the Chiricahua Mountains. It passed directly over the area marked as Apache territory, the place where Nantan's people had their permanent winter camps, their sacred sites. This was it, the motive, the whole ugly truth laid out in red ink. It was a blueprint for annihilation. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the crunch of wagon wheels, the jingle of harnesses, and the low murmur of voices. Headlights swept across the front of the warehouse. 2 men were approaching. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. There was nowhere to run. Nantan acted instantly. He pulled her with him into the deep shadows behind a towering stack of crates. They pressed themselves flat against the rough wood, barely daring to breathe. The warehouse door creaked open. 2 sets of footsteps entered, their spurs ringing on the floor. "Pour me a drink, Crow. My throat's full of dust," a familiar voice rasped. It was Silas Pike. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut. Of all the damnable luck. "You've got your money. Pike, I've got my prisoners. The town is ready to boil over," Marshal Crow's gravelly voice replied. There was the sound of a cork being pulled and liquid glugging into a cup. That fire was a nice touch. Got 'em good and scared. "Scared isn't enough," Pike said, his voice hard. "I need them gone. All of them. That map is my future. Jed, I'm not letting a handful of holdouts stand in the way of it. Your 2 prisoners aren't going to be enough to justify what needs to be done." From her hiding place, Eliza could hear the clink of a bottle against a tin cup. "What do you have in mind?" Crow asked. "Something a little more dramatic," Pike answered. "In 2 days, a crew will be laying track at the edge of the foothills. My men will stage an attack, an ambush. We'll make sure there's a body or 2 left behind. Maybe we'll leave a few Apache arrows in them. For authenticity. When the news hits Red Rock Pass, they'll be begging you to ride into that canyon and finish the job. They'll call you a hero." The sheer, cold-blooded evil of the plan settled over Eliza like a physical weight. This was not just about land anymore. It was a planned massacre, sanctioned and abetted by the law. Crow was silent for a moment. Then he gave a low chuckle. "It'll be a bloody business." "Progress always is," Pike said dismissively. "Now, let's get out of here. This storm's about to break." They heard the men finish their drinks and walk toward the door. The door creaked shut behind them, and the sound of their wagon pulling away faded into the night. Eliza and Nantan remained frozen in the shadows for a long moment, the monstrous reality of what they had just heard hanging in the air between them. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, drumming on the warehouse roof. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. They had to move, and they had to move now. They slipped back out through the warped plank, the rain coming down harder now, cold and sharp. The guard, eager to get out of the storm, had taken shelter on the front porch of the main tent. The darkness and the noise of the growing storm gave them the cover they needed to get away from the depot. They ran, hunched low against the wind, the rain plastering their clothes to their skin. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief, brilliant flash, Eliza saw Nantan's face, a mask of grim fury. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very ground. She stumbled on a loose rock, the heavy satchel containing her chemicals and extra plates swinging wildly. The clasp on the bag gave way. A small, square wooden box tumbled out, landing with a soft thud in the mud. "My chemicals," she cried, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. It was her collodion, the lifeblood of her photography. Without it, the exposed plate in her other bag was just a piece of glass. She turned to go back, but Nantan grabbed her arm. "No, it is too dangerous." Shouts were coming from the camp now. The flash of lightning must have silhouetted them for a second. A lantern bobbed in their direction. "I have to get it," she insisted, pulling against his grip. "The picture is useless without it." Before she could argue further, Nantan released her and darted back into the darkness. He was faster, quieter. He moved like a wraith. She saw him bend down, scoop up the small box, then a rifle shot cracked through the night, the flash of orange powder sharp against the rain. Nantan grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled. For a horrifying second, Eliza thought he had been seriously hit, but he recovered his balance and ran back to her, shoving the precious box into her hands. "Go," he ordered, his voice strained. "Now." They ran, scrambling through the rocks and scrub, the shouts and the rain and the thunder all mingling into a terrifying chaos behind them. They did not stop until they reached the relative safety of a deep, rocky overhang. Collapsing into its shelter, gasping for breath, the rain fell in a solid, gray curtain, masking them from the world. Eliza fumbled with the lantern, her cold, trembling fingers barely able to strike a match. In the flickering light, she saw that Nantan was leaning heavily against the rock wall. His left sleeve was soaked, and the water running down his arm was not just rain. It was dark with blood. "You are shot," she whispered, her voice shaking. He looked down at his arm as if surprised to see the wound. He told her it was just a graze. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his upper arm. Painful, but not serious. His stoicism did nothing to calm the fear that was churning inside her. She felt a wave of guilt so powerful it almost buckled her knees. He had been shot because of her box of chemicals. "Here," she said, her voice taking on a practical, almost harsh tone to cover her terror. "Let me see. Sit down before you fall down." She helped him to the ground, her hands on his shoulders. He was solid and warm, even through his wet clothes. She supported his weight as he eased himself down, his back against the rock. The brief, necessary contact sent a strange jolt through her. It was the first time she had touched him with such intimacy, an intimacy born not of affection, but of sheer, desperate necessity. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and began to clean the wound as best she could in the dim light. Her hands were surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient. "You seem to have a habit of getting your clothes torn when I'm around," she said, her voice a little too bright. "I am going to have to start charging you for repairs." He looked at her, and in the lantern light she could see the lines of pain etched around his eyes. A faint smile touched his lips. "The shirt. I can pay for," he said, his voice low. "The arm might be more expensive." His attempt at humor, so close to her own, broke through her fear. They were here, in the dark, with a storm raging around them and killers hunting them. And they were making quiet, foolish jokes. A bubble of hysterical laughter rose in her throat, and she choked it back. She finished bandaging his arm, pulling the knot tight. They were alive. They were together, and they knew the whole, terrible truth. The knowledge was a burden, but it was also a weapon. And as they sat in silence, listening to the rain, Eliza knew they would see this through to the end, no matter what the cost. Returning to Red Rock Pass was like walking back into a fever dream. The town felt smaller, tighter, the spaces between the buildings charged with a nervous energy. Sour smoke and suspicion hung in the air, a scent far more poisonous than the ash from the burned-out warehouse. They entered not from the main road, but from the back ways and alleys they had used to escape, slipping through the pre-dawn gloom like fugitives, which Eliza supposed they now were. Nantan's arm, stiff and sore beneath its bandage, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the price of their discovery. They separated at the edge of town. Nantan melted into the shadows of the livery stable, promising to watch, to wait. Eliza, pulling her bonnet low to hide her face, walked the last few yards to her shop alone. The street was deserted, the town still sleeping off its troubled night. She let herself in, the familiar scent of coffee and cloth, a strange comfort in a world that had become utterly unfamiliar. Her first priority was the evidence. The 2 exposed glass plates, one of the pike emblem on the wagon, the other of the tracks in Stonejaw Canyon, were their only weapons. They were fragile, irreplaceable. She could not risk Crow finding them. Her eyes fell on the cast-iron stove. It was the heart of her small home, a source of warmth and sustenance. Now, it would be a vault. It was cold, its fire long dead. She carefully swept the gray, feathery ashes to one side, creating a hollow in the center of the firebox. She wrapped each plate in multiple layers of oilcloth, creating a waterproof, light-proof bundle. With the reverence of a priestess handling a sacred relic, she placed the bundle into the hollow and gently covered it with the ashes, smoothing the surface until it looked undisturbed. The truth was now buried in the cold heart of her home, hidden beneath the remnants of old fires, waiting for the spark that would bring it to light. She had just finished and was brewing a pot of coffee, her hands shaking so badly she spilled half the grounds. When the knock came, it was not a knock. It was a hammer blow against the wood of her front door. She did not need to ask who it was. She opened the door to find Marshal Crow and 3 deputies on her boardwalk. Crow's face was a thundercloud, his eyes burning with a furious impatience. He told her he was searching the premises. He shoved a piece of paper at her, a warrant hastily scrawled and barely legal. He said he had reason to believe she was conspiring with fugitives and withholding evidence pertinent to a federal investigation. He did not wait for her permission. He and his men pushed past her, their boots muddying her clean floor. The search was not a search. It was a violation. They overturned bolts of fabric, pulled out drawers of thread and patterns, their clumsy hands desecrating the order she had so carefully built. One of the deputies, a young man with apologetic eyes, started toward her photographic equipment. Crow barked at him to leave it. He said that box was the only honest thing in the room. What he was looking for was smaller. Eliza stood by the counter, her arms crossed, her expression a carefully constructed mask of indignant outrage. Inside, she was a hollow, ringing bell of fear. She watched them, forcing herself to remain still, to not let her gaze stray for even a second toward the stove. Crow himself went to her living quarters in the back, a small room separated by a curtain. She heard him overturning her mattress, rummaging through her small chest of drawers. He was looking for the photographic plates. He knew she had lied. He emerged moments later, his face livid. He had found nothing. He strode up to her, his large frame crowding her, his breath smelling of stale whiskey. He told her he did not know what her game was, but it was over. He said the Apache she was protecting were murderers and arsonists, and by helping them, she was no better. As if summoned by his words, a commotion began to build outside. Shouts, angry and sharp, echoed down the street. Crow's head snapped toward the sound. A grim smile touched his lips. He told her it looked like her friend had been found. He stormed out of the shop, his deputies at his heels. Eliza ran to the window, her heart seizing with dread. In the center of the street, a crowd had formed. It was a mob, a single beast with many mouths, and at its center was Nantan. He stood alone, surrounded. He had been trying to make his way to the edge of town, but someone had spotted him. Now, they pressed in on him, their faces twisted with fear and a rage that had been stoked and fed by Crow's lies. They shouted at him, calling him a savage, a killer. Nantan stood perfectly still, not in surrender, but in a display of profound, unshakable composure. His hands were open at his sides. His gaze was not defiant, but steady, meeting the hatred of the crowd with a quiet dignity that seemed only to infuriate them further. He did not speak, did not react. He was a rock, and the angry tide of the town was breaking against him. Crow and his men moved to the edge of the circle, making no move to intervene, allowing the anger to build, to crest. One of the miners, a large man emboldened by the crowd, shoved Nantan hard. Nantan stumbled but did not fall. The mob surged forward, their raw emotion on the verge of exploding into violence. Then, a new voice cut through the noise, old and cracked but carrying the authority of years. "That's enough." The crowd parted. An old prospector named Harlan pushed his way through. He was a man as weathered as the mountains themselves, his back bent from years of swinging a pickaxe. He walked directly to the front of the mob and stood between them and Nantan, his small, wiry frame a surprising bulwark. Crow shouted at him to get out of the way. Harlan ignored him. He turned his head and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He looked at the faces in the crowd, men he had known for years. He told them they were a pack of fools. He said he had been prospecting in these mountains before most of them were born. He told a story of a time, 10 years past, when his mule had died and his canteen had run dry. He was certain he was going to die out there. He was found by 2 Apache hunters. They could have left him. They could have taken his gear. Instead, they gave him water from their own pouches and shared their dried meat. They had guided him back to the trail. He owed his life to this man's people. He would not stand by and watch a mob of scared children tear a man apart who had done nothing. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Harlan's story was a crack in their unified rage. He was one of them, a voice they knew and, for the most part, respected. It was the opening Eliza needed. She took a deep breath, walked out of her shop, and pushed her way through the stunned crowd until she was standing beside Harlan. All eyes turned to her. She felt the weight of their suspicion, their fear. Her voice, when she spoke, was shockingly clear and steady. She told them that Harlan was right. They were being fools. They were being lied to. She pointed a trembling but determined finger at the marshal. She declared that the fire at the warehouse was not set by the Apache. The Cates brothers' wagon was not raided by the Apache. It was all a lie, a story fabricated to turn them against innocent people. Crow's face went purple with rage. He called her a liar and hysterical. But Eliza did not back down. She had crossed the line. There was no going back now. She announced that she had proof. She had evidence that Silas Pike's company was behind the stolen cattle, and that Marshal Crow was helping him. She told them they were being used, that Pike wanted the land the Apache lived on, and he was willing to burn down the whole town and see them all at each other's throats to get it. Silence. A profound, stunned silence fell over the street. The mob was no longer a single beast. It was a collection of individuals, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, for the first time, a flicker of doubt. They looked from Eliza's earnest, passionate face to Crow's sputtering rage, and then to Nantan, who still had not moved, his expression unreadable. Crow saw he was losing control. His authority was being challenged in front of the entire town. He needed to act, to reassert his power in a way that was brutal and undeniable. He drew his pistol. The crowd gasped and shrank back. He did not point it at Eliza or Harlan. He aimed it at the sky and fired a single shot. In the ringing silence that followed, he gave an order. 2 of his deputies, who had been waiting at the edge of town, rode forward. They were not alone. Behind them, on lead ropes, were 4 people. It was Nahila, the boy Doste, and the 2 hunters who had been arrested earlier. They were Nantan's family. They were Crow's prisoners. Nantan's composure finally broke. A sound, a low growl of anguish and fury, tore from his throat. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. Crow leveled his pistol at Nantan's chest. He told him to stop right there. He announced to the crowd that these were the accomplices. He said he was holding them on suspicion of conspiracy. Then his eyes, cold and hard as chips of obsidian, found Nantan in the crowd. His voice was a steel trap snapping shut. He declared that he knew who the ringleader was. He gave them 48 hours. He demanded that the man responsible for the fire, for the raid, for all of it, surrender himself at the jail. If he did not, his family would be sent to the federal prison at Yuma, a place from which no one returned. He gave his deputies the order to move the prisoners to the jail. Nantan stood frozen, a statue carved from helplessness and rage. He watched them lead away the old woman and the small child. His people, his responsibility. He had come to this town seeking justice, and instead, he had brought ruin upon those he loved most. The crowd melted away, no longer angry, but confused and afraid, leaving Eliza and Nantan standing alone in the street, the marshal's ultimatum hanging between them like a hangman's noose. The 48 hours had begun to tick away. Escape was not a plan. It was a desperate, scrambling flight, with Crow's ultimatum echoing in the streets and Pike's men now openly hunting for them. Red Rock Pass had become a cage. Harlan, the old prospector, proved to be their salvation. Under the cover of that first terrifying night, he led them out of town through a network of old mining tunnels he knew like the back of his own hand. Tunnels that burrowed under the town and emerged into a dark, anonymous arroyo miles away. He had also, with the foresight of a man long accustomed to trouble, secured their horses and the pack mule carrying Eliza's precious equipment. Before leaving them, he pressed a heavy sack of dried meat and cornmeal into Eliza's hands. He told them to stay alive. It was the only way to win. They rode hard for the rest of the night, pushing deeper into the jagged, broken country of the Dragoon Mountains. The land was a fortress of rock and shadow, a place where a person could disappear. The silence of the wilderness was a welcome relief from the angry hum of the town, but it was a silence thick with its own dangers. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of a posse. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of a man with a rifle. Nantan's wound, which had begun to heal, had reopened during their escape. The bandage was soaked through, and Eliza could see the feverish glint in his eyes. He pushed on, his jaw set, but by the second evening, she knew he could not go much further. They found a shallow, hidden canyon, a narrow slit between towering walls of red rock, where a trickle of water from a recent rain still dripped down the stone, feeding a patch of green grass. It was a place of profound peace, a sanctuary. They made a small, smokeless fire. Eliza helped Nantan ease himself down, his back against a smooth, sun-warmed boulder. The sleeve of his shirt was stiff with dried blood. She knew she had to clean and redress the wound properly, or the fever would take him. "This is becoming a ridiculous habit," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She took the hem of his sleeve and tried to tear it, but the cotton was thick and strong. Frustrated, she moved to the tear near his shoulder, the one he had gotten from the knife in the alley, the one she had so neatly mended. She hooked her fingers into the seam and pulled. The threads she had so carefully sewn gave way with a sharp, ripping sound. She tore a long, clean strip from the body of the shirt. Nantan flinched, not from pain, but from the sound, the startling intimacy of the act. He let out a sharp breath, a sound that was half gasp, half pained laugh. His voice was a low, rough whisper, laced with a weary, incredulous humor. She ripped his shirt. He breathed, shaking his head slightly as if in disbelief. Then his dark eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a raw, unguarded mixture of pain, exhaustion, and something else, something warm and startling that made her own breath catch. He gasped again, a ragged sound. "Hell," he said, his voice dropping even lower, thick with an emotion she could not name. "You'll make me lose my mind." Before she could process the words, before she could answer, he leaned forward, A slow, deliberate movement born of fever and a desperate need for contact. He buried his face in the curve of her neck and the wild tangle of her hair, his breath hot against her skin. It was not a kiss, not a caress. It was an act of surrender. It was the collapsing of a wall that had been held up for too long by pride and pain. He was not a stoic warrior in that moment, but a man, wounded and hunted, seeking a moment of shelter from the storm that raged both outside and within him. His whole body trembled against hers. A fine, sharp shudder of tension finally released. Eliza froze for a heartbeat, every nerve in her body alight. Then, her own walls, the ones she had so carefully constructed around her heart after her husband's death, began to crumble. She did not pull away. She did not move. She simply allowed it, her hand coming up to rest gently on the back of his head, her fingers tangling in his long, black hair. They stayed like that for a long moment, two fugitives clinging to each other in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind through the canyon, the slow drip of water on rock, and the unsteady beating of their own hearts. It was a promise, unspoken but deeply felt, a promise to survive. When he finally pulled back, the space between them felt charged, different. The fever still burned in his eyes, but the hard, guarded look was gone, replaced by a weary vulnerability. The shared moment had stripped away all pretense. She cleaned his wound with the last of her carbolic acid and water from the spring, her touch gentle and sure. As she worked, they began to talk, their voices low in the gathering twilight. The words, held back for so long, came easily now. He told her about his past. He had not always been at odds with the white men. For a time, years ago, he had worked as a scout for the army. He had done it not for glory or adventure, but for food and blankets for his people during a hard winter when the game had disappeared and the government rations had failed to arrive. He had thought he was making a practical choice, a bargain to ensure their survival. But it had cost him. The army officers had never truly trusted him, seeing him as a tool, a savage with a useful skill. And some of his own people had seen him as a traitor, a man who walked in the white man's world. He was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, trusted by no one. The guilt of that choice, he admitted, was a heavy stone he had carried for a long time. As she tied the new bandage, a clean white strip against his dark skin, Eliza found herself telling him about her own past. She spoke of her husband, a good, quiet man who had dreamed of striking it rich in the silver mines. He had hated the dark, the closeness of the earth, but he had gone down into that hole every day for her, for the life they had planned to build. When he died in a tunnel collapse, the town had been kind for a time, but soon their pity had curdled into something else. As a widow with a small inheritance, she was seen as a commodity, a prize to be won. Men who had been her husband's friends made clumsy, unwanted advances. The town's respectable matrons watched her with suspicion, as if her unmarried status were a threat to their own domestic security. She had opened her shop not just to make a living, but to build a fortress, a small, independent kingdom where she could be her own person, not just someone's daughter, or someone's wife, or someone's widow. They talked as the stars emerged, bright and impossibly close in the clear desert sky. They were from different worlds, a Chiricahua warrior and a town seamstress, but they found a common ground in their shared loneliness, in their mutual fight for a small patch of dignity in a world that sought to deny them. Their love, if it could be called that yet, was not a sudden, romantic flame. It was a slow, steady ember, fanned to life by shared danger, mutual respect, and the profound comfort of being truly seen by another person. The rain began to fall just after midnight, a soft, steady drumming on the canvas of the small lean-to she had rigged. It was a gentle, healing rain, washing the dust from the air and the blood from the rocks. It felt like a benediction. She looked at him, his face softened by sleep, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. The fever had broken. The bandage on his arm, the torn fabric of his shirt, the steady, rhythmic sound of the rain, It all felt like a kind of rebirth. A fierce resolve hardened in her heart. She would not let Crow and Pike win. She would not let them destroy this man, his family, his people. She thought of the glass plates buried in the ashes of her stove. They were not just evidence anymore. They were a testament. They were a vow. She would get those pictures into the light. She would show the world the truth. She would save his family. And in doing so, she knew she would also be saving herself. She sat and watched him sleep, the sound of the rain a quiet promise, and waited for the dawn. There was no time for healing. The 48-hour clock that Marshal Crow had started was a relentless, audible ticking in the silence of the canyon. Nantan's fever was gone, but a deep weariness had settled into his bones. Yet, in his eyes, a new fire burned, an unbending resolve forged in the helplessness of watching his family taken. They could not wait. To wait was to surrender. The plan was born from their two disparate worlds, a desperate fusion of ancient knowledge and modern invention. Nantan knew the land, every crack and fissure, every secret path that wound through the rocks around Red Rock Pass. He knew of a narrow game trail that led to a series of crevices behind the town's main structures, a path that would allow them to approach the makeshift jail, a reinforced storage shed behind the marshal's office, without being seen from the street. Eliza, in turn, knew the properties of light and chemistry. In her heavy pack, among her bottles and glass plates, was a small, sealed tin of magnesium powder. It was a tool of her trade, used to create a brilliant, instantaneous flash of light for taking photographs in dim conditions. A flash bright enough to capture a fleeting image on a glass plate. A flash bright enough, she reasoned, to blind a man for a few crucial seconds. She explained it to him in a low, urgent voice, her hands sketching their movements in the dirt. She would prepare a trough of the powder with a fuse. At his signal, she would ignite it. The flash would disorient the guards posted outside the shed. In that moment of blindness and confusion, he would have his chance. It was a wild, improbable scheme, relying on split-second timing and a great deal of luck. But it was the only plan they had. They would not just rescue the prisoners. Eliza was adamant. They had to get the other proof, Pike's ledger, the book that would tie him directly to Crow and the whole conspiracy. Nantan had seen Pike carry it into the marshal's office that night at the depot, with the entire town on edge. It was likely the safest place for Pike to keep it. The rescue would have to create a diversion big enough for one of them to slip into the office itself. They set out as the storm from the previous night gathered itself for a second assault. The clouds rolled in, low and heavy, and a cold, misty rain began to fall, slicking the red rocks until they shone like polished garnet. The rain was a gift, muffling their sounds and making the night darker. They moved with a desperate speed, their progress a painful, scrambling journey through the treacherous terrain. As they neared Red Rock Pass, the tension became a physical thing, a tight band around Eliza's chest. The town was a scatter of weak, yellow lights against the oppressive dark. It looked wounded, fearful. They tethered the horses in a thicket of mesquite and crept the last half-mile on foot, the mud sucking at their boots. Nantan led her to the hidden trail. It was little more than a whisper of a path, a narrow ledge that hugged the base of the cliffs behind the town. They moved in single file, Eliza's hand often brushing against the cold, wet rock for balance. Below them, they could see the back of the marshal's office and the dark, solid shape of the shed where the prisoners were being held. Two guards stood under a small overhang, trying to keep dry. They were Pike's men, not deputies. Their silhouettes were visible against the light spilling from the office window. They smoked cigarettes, their voices carrying faintly on the damp air. Inside the office, Eliza could see the shapes of two men at a desk, Crow and Pike. Their presence there, so close, was both a danger and an opportunity. Eliza found a flat, sheltered spot on the ledge directly above the guards. She took out the tin of magnesium and a small, flat piece of metal she used as a flash pan. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. She poured a thick line of the silvery powder into the pan and laid a short, waterproof fuse at one end. Everything was ready. She looked down at Nantan, who had moved closer to the edge of the trail, poised to descend the moment she lit the fuse. He met her gaze, and in the darkness, he gave a single, sharp nod. Eliza struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with her body. The fuse caught, sputtering for a terrifying second before igniting with a whoosh. The world exploded in a silent, instantaneous blast of pure white light. It was brighter than the sun, a searing chemical glare that bleached the color from everything and burned sharp, black afterimages onto the eye. The two guards cried out, throwing their hands over their faces, stumbling backward, completely blinded. In that instant, Nantan moved. He was a blur of motion, dropping from the ledge to the ground with a soft thud and covering the distance to the shed in a few silent strides. He slammed the heavy bar off the door's latch. The door swung open. From inside, the two Apache hunters emerged, ready, their eyes already adjusted to the dark. Behind them came Nahila, her face a mask of calm resolve. She held Dost's hand, the boy's face buried in her skirts, shielding him from the chaos. More shouts came from the marshal's office. The door was thrown open, but the flash had been aimed perfectly, its brilliant light pouring through the windows. Crow and Pike were as blind as their guards. What in the hell was that? Pike roared, his voice thick with panic. As Nantan herded his family toward the dark crevice that would lead them to safety, Eliza saw her chance. She scrambled down from the ledge, her own vision spotted with floating black dots from the flash. She ran not toward the escaping prisoners, but toward the marshal's office. A third guard, who had been further away, was recovering his sight. He raised his rifle, trying to make sense of the shadowy figures melting into the darkness. Just as he took aim, a shot rang out, not from his gun, but from the far end of the street. The bullet kicked up dirt a few feet in front of him, a clear warning. The guard spun around, confused. Eliza saw him then. It was the young gunman from the ridge, Luke Mercer. He stood half hidden in an alleyway, his pistol still raised. He had not fired at them. He had fired to save them. He met Eliza's eyes for a fraction of a second, his expression a turmoil of fear and decision. Then he vanished back into the shadows. His conscience had finally won. The warning shot had bought them the precious seconds they needed. Eliza slipped through the open door of the marshal's office. Crow and Pike were still rubbing their eyes, cursing and yelling. On the desk, illuminated by a lantern, lay the ledger book, open to a page of neatly written columns, names, dates, and figures. She did not hesitate. She snatched the heavy book from the desk, tucked it under her arm, and was out the door before either man had fully recovered his sight. She ran, her lungs burning, following the path Nantan had taken. She caught up with them at the mouth of the dark, narrow canyon that served as their escape route. Nantan was there, waiting for her. He saw the book under her arm, and a look of fierce approval flashed in his eyes. He took her hand and pulled her along. "Now we run," he said. The escape was a nightmare of mud and water. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the dry arroyos into churning, brown rivers. They scrambled over rocks and through thick brush, Nahila and the men moving with a speed and certainty that amazed Eliza. They were being pursued. Rifle shots echoed behind them, the bullets whining off the rocks. They reached a wide, shallow wash just as a wall of water, a flash flood born from the storm in the mountains above, came roaring down its center. They were cut off. For a moment, despair seized Eliza. They were trapped. But Nantan, reading the land even in the chaotic darkness, pointed upstream. There was a place, he said, where the canyon walls narrowed, a place they could cross. They raced along the edge of the flood, the roar of the water a constant, terrifying thunder. They reached the narrows and scrambled across, leaping from boulder to boulder, the muddy water swirling around their ankles. They were safe, for the moment. Their pursuers were stranded on the other side. They did not stop moving until just before dawn. Nantan led them to a hidden cave he knew of, its entrance masked by a curtain of willows. The inside of the cave was a startling, brilliant white. The walls were made of pure gypsum, smooth and pale, reflecting the light from Eliza's lantern until the entire space glowed with a soft, ethereal light. They collapsed on the dry floor, soaked, muddy, and utterly exhausted, but they were all alive, and they were free. Nantan's family was safe, and in Eliza's hands, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect it from the rain, was the ledger, the final piece of the puzzle. Eliza looked at the smooth, white walls of the cave. They were a blank canvas. She opened her pack and began to carefully unpack her chemicals and her precious, exposed glass plates. Here, in this secret, glowing heart of the earth, she would bring the truth to light. The gypsum cave had been their dark room, their sanctuary, and their war room, working by the soft, reflected glow of a single lantern. Eliza had transformed the raw evidence of the glass plates into undeniable proof. The white gypsum walls became her canvas. She had made contact prints, positive images on treated paper, using the carefully preserved chemicals and the controlled light of the lantern. The process was painstaking, a delicate chemical ballet performed in the heart of the earth. When she was finished, she had 2 sets of images, the original, ghostly negatives on the glass plates, and a half-dozen clear, sharp paper prints that showed every detail. The pike brand, the wagon ruts, the damning horseshoe. They timed their return to coincide with market day. It was a calculated risk. The town would be crowded, full of farmers from outlying homesteads and miners down from the hills to spend their pay. It was the one day when strangers could move through the streets without attracting too much attention. It was also the day the circuit judge, Judge Silas Miller, was scheduled to be in town, holding court in the saloon, the only building large enough for the purpose. Their 48 hours were nearly up. It was now or never. Nantan, his family, and the 2 freed hunters slipped into town from the south, taking refuge in the deep shadows of the livery stable, where Harlan stood a quiet, watchful guard. Eliza walked into the heart of the chaos alone. The market square was a riot of noise and color. Farmers hawked vegetables, a blacksmith hammered out horseshoes, and miners bartered for supplies. The air was thick with the smells of horseflesh, frying bacon, and dust. But beneath the surface of this boisterous commerce, a current of fear still ran. Men wore their pistols openly. Conversation stopped when strangers drew near. The town was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Eliza carried a simple wooden frame she had fashioned from the remains of a broken crate. She walked to the very center of the square, to the public notice board that stood beside the main water trough. With a small hammer and 4 nails, she affixed the frame to the board. Then, with the whole square seeming to hold its breath and watch her, she took out the 2 glass plates. She slotted them carefully into the frame, one above the other. The morning sun, bright and unforgiving, shone through them. The effect was immediate and profound. The images on the glass, dark and ethereal, were projected by the sun onto the pale, dusty wood of the notice board. They were like visions from another world. A crowd began to gather, first out of curiosity, then in a murmur of confusion. They saw the image of the wrecked supply wagon, and there, on the side of a crate, was the unmistakable circle and line of the Pike Railroad and Lumber Company. They saw the second image, a close view of a patch of earth, showing the deep rut of a wagon wheel and the print of a horseshoe, and on that horseshoe, clear as day, was the same circular brand. "What is this?" Eliza Hank the miner asked, his voice a low rumble. "It is the truth," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the murmuring crowd. "That is Silas Pike's brand on a crate from the wagon the Apache were accused of raiding, and that is Pike's brand on a horseshoe from the trail where hundreds of stolen cattle were driven to frame Nantan's people." A man in the crowd, One of Pike's laborers shouted that she was a liar, that the pictures were tricks. Others took up the cry, but many were silent, their faces a canvas of dawning doubt. They were simple men, miners and farmers, but they understood the physical evidence of a brand. It was a language more honest than words. Just then, Silas Pike himself pushed through the crowd, Marshal Crowe at his side. Pike's face was flushed with anger. He saw the images on the board, and for a second, a flicker of pure panic crossed his features before he masked it with blustering rage. He bellowed that this was nonsense. He accused her of being a traitor, of manufacturing evidence to help murderers. Crowe drew his pistol, telling the crowd to disperse, that this was an illegal assembly. But before he could enforce his command, a new voice of authority cut through the tension. "Put that weapon away, Marshal." Judge Miller stood on the steps of the saloon. He was a tall, stern man with a thick white mustache and eyes that had seen every form of human desperation and deceit. The circuit court was now in session, he announced, and it appeared they had their first case. Eliza seized the moment. She walked directly to the judge, the crowd parting before her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not know she possessed. "I wish to present evidence of a conspiracy to commit theft and murder. A conspiracy led by Silas Pike and aided and abetted by Marshal Jed Crowe." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer a simple accusation. This was a formal charge, laid at the feet of the law itself. Judge Miller's eyes narrowed. He looked from Eliza's determined face to the furious expressions of Pike and Crowe. "Those are serious charges, madam. You had better have more than just shadows on a piece of glass." "I do, Your Honor," Eliza said. She held up the heavy leather-bound ledger. "I have Silas Pike's own account book, stolen from your office." "Marshal," she added, looking directly at Crowe, "it details payments made to you, a schedule of cattle shipments that match the dates of local rustling, and plans for a railroad line running directly through protected Apache lands." She handed the book to the judge, who began to thumb through its pages, his expression growing more grim with every line he read. The square was utterly silent now. The townspeople held in a state of suspended shock. "This is damning," the judge said finally, looking up at Pike. "Do you have anything to say to this?" Pike sputtered, his face a mask of sweat and fury. He called it all lies, fabrications. "Is there anyone who can corroborate this woman's story?" the judge asked, his gaze sweeping the crowd. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. Eliza's heart sank. Had it all been for nothing? Would no one stand with her? Then, a figure stepped out from an alleyway. It was Luke Mercer. He was pale and trembling, but he walked with a steady, determined gait until he stood before the judge. "I can," Luke said, his voice cracking but clear. "I can corroborate it. I was there. I work for Mr. Pike. He hired me and a dozen others to drive those stolen cattle. He told us it was to create a trail, to lay the blame for it all on the Apache. He planned an ambush on his own railroad crew, to make it look like an attack, to give the marshal an excuse to clean out the canyon." He swallowed hard, his eyes finding Eliza's for a second. It was wrong. What we were doing was wrong. Luke's confession was the spark that lit the fuse. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony undeniable. The crowd turned as one, their doubt and fear finally crystallizing into a cold, hard anger directed at the two men who had so thoroughly betrayed them. Silas Pike saw it in their eyes. He saw the end of his ambition, the cold reality of a prison cell, or worse, a rope. The arrogance and bluster fell away, leaving only the raw, panicked animal beneath. With a wild cry of rage, he drew his pistol. He did not aim at the judge or Luke. He aimed at the crowd. He fired once, twice, the shots deafening in the enclosed square. Chaos erupted. People screamed and dove for cover. Market stalls were overturned, their contents spilling into the dust. It was a stampede of terror. In that instant of pandemonium, the rule of law dissolved completely, replaced by the rule of the gun. Marshal Crowe saw his own end in the chaos. But he was a different kind of animal than Pike. He was a cornered rat, cunning and vicious. He saw one last, desperate chance. While all eyes were on Pike, Crow lunged, not for his own gun, but for Eliza. He grabbed her from behind, his thick arm locking around her throat, cutting off her air. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. The crowd froze, their panic momentarily checked by this new, more intimate horror. "Everybody stay back," Crow screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "Stay back or I will kill her right here." He began to drag her backward, away from the saloon, away from the judge, using her body as a shield. The townsfolk, who moments before had been ready to tear him apart, were now helpless, their hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Where are you going?" Crow, the judge, demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "Out of this town," Crow yelled back, his eyes wild. He was dragging Eliza toward the steep, rocky path that led up the bluff on the north side of town, a place the locals called Horseshoe Bluff. Anyone follows, and she is dead. From the deep shadows of the livery stable, Nantan watched, his entire being a single, taut chord of agony and rage. He saw the woman he cared for being used as a shield, a pawn in a coward's last move. He could not act. A single shot from him, even if it found its mark, could startle Crow's trigger finger. He was helpless, forced to watch as the man who had imprisoned his family now dragged the woman who had saved them toward the high, lonely cliffs. The legal battle was over. The battle of bullets and blood had just begun. The climb up Horseshoe Bluff was a brutal, scraping ascent. Marshal Jed Crow dragged Eliza with him, his arm a band of iron across her throat, the barrel of his pistol a cold, round period against her temple. Each step was a battle. Loose scree slid under their feet, and the wind, funneling down from the high peaks, tore at them, trying to peel them from the mountainside. Eliza did not fight him in a way that would make him tighten his grip. Instead, she made herself a dead weight, stumbling, forcing him to haul her, to expend his strength, to slow their progress. Her mind, however, was not a dead weight. It was racing, searching for a flaw, an opening, a single moment of opportunity. Below them, the chaos in the town square had muted into a distant, confused roar. She could not see Nantan. She could not see anyone but the terrified faces of her neighbors. Frozen in place by the marshal's desperate act, she was on her own. The air grew thinner, colder, as they neared the summit. The path narrowed until it was a mere ledge, a lip of rock overlooking a sheer drop of several hundred feet. Finally, they reached the top. It was not a peak, but a flat, wind-swept promontory of rock, shaped like its namesake. The wind was a physical force here, a constant, shrieking pressure that pushed them toward the edge. Crow shoved her forward until her boots were inches from the precipice. The world fell away before her, a dizzying panorama of the town, the desert, and the distant, hazy mountains. Crow was breathing in ragged, gulping breaths, his face slick with sweat despite the cold wind. His eyes were wild, the eyes of a man who had not only lost a gamble, but had overturned the entire table in a fit of rage. He spun her around to face him, his back to the drop, using the open sky as his shield. He was shouting over the wind, his voice raw. He proclaimed that they did not understand. He had brought order to this town. He had made it safe. He was the law. The words were a mad litany, the final testament of a man whose authority had crumbled to dust. Eliza's heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, but she forced her voice to be steady. She had to keep him talking. She had to keep him focused on her. She looked him directly in the eye, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. She said aloud that the law was supposed to be about justice. His law seemed to have a spelling error. She told him. It looked a lot more like greed. The words, small and sharp, cut through his frantic self-justification. His face contorted, the madness in his eyes sharpening into pure, focused hatred. He raised the pistol, pressing it so hard against her skin that she knew his finger was tightening on the trigger. This was it, the final second. Then, a sound. It was not from the town below or the wind beside them. It came from the canyon itself, from the labyrinth of rocks and crevices that surrounded the bluff. It was a high, piercing cry, the call of a hunting hawk, but deeper, more resonant. A sound that seemed to come from the very stones. It struck the far wall of the canyon and bounced back, an echo that sounded like a second cry from a different direction. Crow flinched. His head snapped toward the source of the sound, his gunman's instincts overriding his rage. Who was there? Who was flanking him? That single, reflexive glance was the only opening Eliza would get. As his head turned, another movement caught his eye. Closer, more immediate. From a fissure in the rock face not 10 yards away, figures were emerging. It was Nahila, her face a mask of grim determination. Behind her were the two hunters, their hands empty but their movements swift and sure. They did not rush him. They simply appeared, spreading out, creating a line, cutting off any possible retreat along the bluff. They were creating a path for her. Eliza did not wait. She drove her elbow backward with all her strength, aiming for the soft part of his stomach. The blow landed, and Crow grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She twisted, ducking under his arm, breaking free. She scrambled away from him, toward Nahila, her feet slipping on the loose stones. Crow roared in fury and turned, raising his pistol to fire at her retreating back. But a shadow detached itself from the rocks near the trail. It was Nantan. He moved with a devastating speed, closing the distance while Crow was still focused on Eliza. He did not make a sound. The fight on the cliff edge was not a thing of grace or skill. It was a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. Nantan's objective was not to kill, but to disarm. He slammed into Crow, his shoulder driving into the marshal's side. The pistol flew from Crow's hand, skittering across the rock and disappearing over the edge. Now it was just two men, their bodies straining against each other, feet shuffling for purchase on the narrow ledge. The wind howled around them, a third combatant in the fray. Crow was bigger, heavier, his strength born of brute force and desperation. Nantan was quicker, his movements more economical, using Crow's own momentum against him. They were a tangle of limbs, grunting with effort, their struggle a stark, elemental drama against the vast, empty sky. Down in the town square, the chaos had found a new focus. Silas Pike, his face a mask of disbelief, tried to flee into the crowd, but his path was blocked by Luke Mercer. The young gunman held his pistol steady, though his hands trembled. Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He told the boy to get out of his way. He said he was just a hired hand. Luke shook his head. He said it was over. He had to make it right. Pike lunged, trying to knock the gun aside, but other hands joined the fray. Hank the miner grabbed one of Pike's arms. Harlan, the old prospector, caught the other. The people of the town, who had been a terrified, scattered mob only moments before, now acted as one. They converged on Pike, their collective courage finally ignited. They stripped the gun from his hand, and someone produced a coil of rope. Within moments, Silas Pike, the man who had played them all for fools, was bound and helpless on the ground. His face pressed into the dust he had been so eager to claim. Luke Mercer stood over him, the pistol hanging limply at his side, the fight over. High above, on the bluff, the struggle reached its climax. Crow, in a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, shoved Nantan backward, breaking his grip. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for Nantan's throat, his face a grotesque mask of murderous intent. It was an act of pure, blind aggression. A step too far. His feet, seeking purchase for his forward lunge, found only the loose, crumbling shale at the very edge of the precipice. He had misjudged the distance by inches. There was a moment of perfect, horrible stillness, as his own momentum carried him past the point of no return. His eyes widened, his rage replaced by a sudden, stark terror. He did not scream, he simply fell. He did not plummet into the abyss. The bluff did not drop away in a perfect sheer. Its side was a steep, treacherous slope of sand and loose rock. Crow hit this slope and tumbled, a clumsy, ragdoll figure rolling and sliding down the long, steep incline, his fall broken by scrub brush and outcroppings of rock. He came to a rest far below, a crumpled, unmoving heap on a wide sandbar at the base of the cliff. He was alive, but broken, defeated not by a hero, but by the weight of his own violence. Nantan stood at the edge, his chest heaving, the wind tearing at his torn shirt. He watched the still form below for a long moment. Eliza came to his side, her hand finding his arm. Below them, the town was coming back to life. People were emerging from their hiding places, their faces turned upward toward the bluff. They had seen it all. The wind began to die down, its fury spent. The high, keening shriek softened to a low, mournful sigh. The echo of Nantan's call, the call that had started it all, seemed to linger in the air, a whisper of conscience that had finally been answered. The aftermath on Horseshoe Bluff was not triumphant. It was stark and quiet. The wind died down as if in deference to the gravity of the moment, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the distant, confused sounds from the town below. Nantan stood at the precipice, his chest rising and falling, the adrenaline of the fight slowly draining away, leaving a profound weariness in its place. Eliza moved to his side, her presence a silent anchor in the vast, empty sky. Together, they looked down at the crumpled form of Jed Crow, a broken man at the bottom of the cliff he had chosen as his last stand. The descent was slow and methodical. By the time they reached the town, Judge Miller had restored a semblance of order. Luke Mercer, his face pale but his resolve firm, stood guard over a bound and sullen Silas Pike. A small party of men, led by Harlan, had already made their way to the base of the bluff and were carrying the marshal up on a makeshift stretcher. He was alive, his body a collection of broken bones, but his reign was definitively over. Judge Miller, his face a grim mask, took charge. He formally deputized Harlan and Hank the miner on the spot, their authority now backed by the full weight of the circuit court. Pike was locked in the very same shed that had held Nantan's family. Crow was taken to the town's small infirmary, a federal prisoner under armed guard. A rider was dispatched to the territorial capital. Justice, it turned out, was not a single explosive moment on a cliff. It was a slow, grinding process of paperwork, testimony, and the methodical application of the law. 2 days later, a squad of federal marshals rode into Red Rock Pass. They were quiet, professional men who listened intently to Judge Miller, reviewed Eliza's photographs and Pike's ledger, and took sworn statements from Eliza, Nantan, and Luke Mercer. They loaded Crow and Pike into a caged prison wagon, and without ceremony, rode out of town, leaving behind a community grappling with the raw, gaping wound of their betrayal. The resolution of the land dispute was, like the justice that had preceded it, a thing of frustrating, realistic compromise. Judge Miller, citing the overwhelming evidence of Pike's conspiracy, issued a temporary injunction, placing the Apache lands under the protection of the court until the federal government could conduct a formal review. It was not a permanent victory. It did not return what had been lost, but it was a reprieve. It was a space to breathe. It was hope. In the days that followed, a new quiet settled over the town. It was not the tense, fearful silence of before, but a somber quiet of reflection and mourning. 2 men had died in the chaos of Pike's desperate final act. A farmer caught in the crossfire and one of Pike's own hired guns. A young man no older than Luke. A funeral was held on the small hill behind the church. Nearly the entire town attended, their faces a mixture of grief and shame. Nantan and his family stood at a respectful distance, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the shared loss. Eliza was there with her camera, but she did not photograph the graves. At the request of the farmer's widow, she took a formal portrait of the surviving family, the children scrubbed and solemn, the woman's face etched with a grief too deep for tears. Eliza worked with a gentle reverence, her purpose no longer to expose a crime, but to preserve a memory, to capture the dignity of those who remained. The click of her camera's shutter was a small, sharp sound against the quiet sorrow, a testament to the fact that life, however battered, went on. They did not stay in the town, nor did they retreat deep into the mountains. They chose a place in between, a small, unclaimed parcel of land where a clear stream tumbled out of a canyon and wound its way through a grove of cottonwood trees. It was a place that belonged to both of their worlds, and to neither. Here, they began to build, with help from Harlan and some of the other miners, who worked for no pay, only for the quiet satisfaction of setting a small piece of the world right. They built a small cabin. It was not large, but it was solid, made of pine logs and river stones. One side of the main room, with its large, north-facing window, became Eliza's studio, a place for her camera and her chemicals. The other side was for living, with a large stone fireplace that Nantan built with his own hands. Nahila and the other women from Nantan's family came often. They showed Eliza which plants by the stream were good for medicine and which roots were good to eat. Nahila, her gnarled fingers moving with a lifetime of practice, began to teach Eliza how to harvest the sharp, spiky leaves of the agave plant and how to beat them against a rock to release the strong, pale fibers within. She taught her how to spin those fibers into thread and how to weave that thread on a simple, handmade loom. As Eliza's clumsy fingers slowly learned the ancient rhythms, she felt a connection to this land, to these people, that went deeper than any photograph. In return, Eliza taught the children, including a wide-eyed Doste, how to read a few simple words and how to mix the chemicals to make a picture appear on paper as if by magic. They were building more than a house. They were weaving a new life, a small, sturdy fabric made from the threads of their two different existences. One evening, as the last of the season's rains fell in a soft, misty drizzle outside, they sat before the crackling fire. The cabin was filled with the scent of wood smoke and the rich, dark aroma of brewing coffee. Eliza was mending a tear in one of Nantan's spare shirts, her needle moving in a steady, comforting rhythm. Nantan had been watching her, his expression quiet and thoughtful. He got up and went to the small wooden chest where he kept his few belongings. He returned with a folded piece of cloth. He laid it gently on the table in front of her. It was the shirt, the one she had mended in her shop, the one she had ripped in the canyon. The seams, one neat and precise, the other more hurried and rough, were a map of their journey. He placed his hand over hers, stilling the movement of her needle. His voice was low and steady, as clear and calm as the stream outside their door. "I do not need a new shirt," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "I only need the one who knew how to sew me whole." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a declaration as solid and real as the stone of the fireplace behind them. Eliza felt tears well in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She set aside her sewing and her hand found his, their fingers lacing together, a perfect, seamless fit. The dawn broke, soft and gray. The light filtered through the gentle, persistent rain. A thin curl of smoke rose from their chimney into the clean, washed air. Inside, the fire crackled, and the smell of coffee was a warm, welcoming promise. Eliza handed Nantan a steaming mug, a small, teasing smile playing on her lips. "You had better be careful," she said, her voice laced with a gentle, loving humor. "Do not make me rip your shirt again." A low laugh rumbled in his chest. He set his mug down and drew her close, his arms circling her waist. He did not answer with words. Instead, he simply buried his face in her hair, in the warm, familiar curve of her neck. The gesture was the same as it had been in the canyon, born of desperation and fever. But now, it was different. It was not a surrender to pain, but a surrender to peace. It was not shelter from a storm, but the profound, quiet comfort of home. A home they had chosen, a home they had built, together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.